On the latest Brexit developments, I'm joined by Kevin Matthews. He's an assistant professor from George Mason University. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
So a lot to untangle there. Let's start with what Theresa May actually accomplished today that she hadn't before in this Brexit process.
I think she's finally proved that she has three objectives: to keep the Conservative Party united, to keep the Conservative Party in office, and to keep herself at number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. And that is about it.
So in terms of then what she's actually taking to the EU, is it all for naught, or is she actually bringing something to the table, they've already essentially closed the door on negotiating?
Yes, well, according to the French President, Emmanuel Macron, this is a waste of time. But from her perspective, it's not, because the Conservative Party is tearing itself apart over this issue. You have to remember, Brexit came about because of an intra-party squabble fight that's been going on since the 1990s at least. And Theresa May has recognized that if she doesn't do something, some kind of a Hail Mary pass like this, that she is not going to be leader of the country much longer.
But if we know that it's actually not going to pass, well, at least based on what Emmanuel Macron was saying, if we know that the EU isn't going to have any wiggle room, what was the point of this?
Well, the point was to kick the can down the road yet again, which has been what Mrs. May has been doing for the last 2 years, and to try to find a way to convince the MPs who voted against her deal that there is no alternative but a hard Brexit. Everybody says they don't want a hard Brexit. The problem is they can't agree on what they do want. And so what she said today in the House of Commons was that it was time for her to go to Brussels so she could present to her fellow EU leaders a plan that the British Parliament will pass. The problem with that is that the EU has already agreed to a way out for the British, and they've said enough is enough. They've got other things on their agenda, and they frankly think that the British are acting childish.
And what about people themselves, the ones not in Parliament, who are having to live with the consequences of all this unravelling? How are their everyday lives changing now versus what could happen after the March 29th deadline?
They seem to think that or at least a plurality seem to think, that if they get out, no matter what way, that Brexit will be over and done with and they can move on with their lives. I don't think they've considered that this is not going to end on the 29th of March. For one thing, if there's a hard Brexit, then they can expect food shortages and shortages of medicine. Some leaders of restaurant chains and businesses such as Sainsbury's, McDonald's, and others have announced that the British consumer is going to face a good deal of hardship, at least in the short term. And nobody is considering what that short term could be if it becomes a medium term or a long term, because they haven't worked out a trade deal. The problem is Ireland. The problem is that everyone says they don't want a hard border in Ireland because that would bring back the violence. And anybody who thinks that it won't should remember that the current troubles, the troubles from '69 to '98, started in the late '60s during the civil rights movement there, when everyone thought that the bad old days were over, that the Irish Republican Army wouldn't come back. Right. And they were wrong about that. And this could happen yet again.
Now, we know that out of fear, a lot of people are stockpiling, whether it's food, medicine, supplies. Is this smart planning, or is it worth their while to do this?
They really haven't got much choice, have they? If they don't stockpile, they could be in for a very hard time. That's what this letter from these business leaders was trying to say. We can only stockpile so much, right, so you should be prepared for shortages. The Brexit leaders have never really confronted that problem.
So then do we know if there's going to be any sort of consumer protection then in case businesses start price gouging consumers, being that things are going to be, the supply is going to be a lot tighter?
Oh, I'm sure the government says that they'll step in, but so far they've given no indication that they've got any firm plans. So they're just winging it, so to speak. And everyone is so tentative about this because nobody really knows what's going to come next. No one expected that Mrs. May would do what she did today. She had said for months that it was either her deal or a hard Brexit. And she turns up today and says, well, I can go back and renegotiate. She's doing this because of the conservative backbenchers who are led by a man named Sir Graham Brady. His amendment was proposed and accepted by the government to propose alternatives to what's called the Irish backstop. And the EU has made it quite clear that those alternatives simply aren't viable right now.
So what do we know about in terms of things like schools, education, university, something that obviously a lot of people travel to England for? But essentially the very basis of what people are going to do with their children. Do we have any indication of how this is all going to impact them?
I don't know about education, but it's been revealed that if there is a hard Brexit, if there's no deal, for instance, people living in the EU who are British citizens will no longer have access to free health care or the health insurance that they have in whatever country they live in. And those people are in for a hard time too if this isn't sorted out.
Certainly worth keeping in mind. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Kevin Matthews, Assistant Professor from George Mason University.